Hello, everybody. There we go. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I need to get used to this. So my name is Adam Levine, and I'm here to talk about this book that came out earlier this year. And I want to thank you all for being here to hear about it and hopefully ask questions after I'm done. So first of all, I just want to, in case you haven't seen it already, this is what the book looks like. You know, I don't have any children, and so this is the closest thing I have to a kid. And so I like to put this up and admire its chubby cheeks. So there you go. And there's actual real copies in the back in that corner over there. What I want to do today is talk a lot about the book, and definitely sort of talk about some of the key sort of substantive claims that are in the book and sort of why they're important and why they can help us understand what we are seeing in American politics now and conversely what we're not seeing. But before I do that, I want to sort of share with you a broader sort of new way of thinking about civic engagement more generally. That of which the book is one example, and then a lot of other research that I'm currently engaged in would be many other examples. And so when I talk about civic engagement, I'm referring, at a very basic level, to individuals who are spending time, money, cognitive attention, and other kinds of scarce resources on politics in one way or another. And so that would be that's what I mean by civic engagement. And when I'm not the first person to write about that at all. In fact, many people have written about that, and many people continue to write about that. But the most common explanations that you hear when people talk about civic engagement have to do either with individual level attributes that are relatively immutable. And so that might be things like, for example, a person's income or a person's wealth or a person's education level or a person's overall level interest in politics. Okay? Or it might refer to the presence or absence of organizations that might mobilize them to get them involved in an issue that might be of import to them. And I would argue that both of those are extremely important. And I would never argue that either of those is not important at all. But what I offer in the book, and what I offer in sort of my broader research agenda, is a new way of thinking about civic engagement that focuses on communication and focuses specifically on the kinds of thoughts that come to mind in people's minds when they are mobilized around a particular issue, and how it is that that communication might present new kinds of barriers and challenges to civic engagement that previous work has really not focused on. Okay, and so that's sort of the overall scope of sort of what I'm trying to do here, this focus on communication. Okay, all right. So you might sort of say, okay, well, I mean, maybe it sounds obvious, maybe it doesn't. Why is it that we care about civic engagement in the first place? And I think, the main reason, so one possible reason is just because the more civically engaged citizens are, the better they might be as people for a variety of reasons. Another reason, if we want to think about sort of impacting policy and impacting the political agenda, has to do with the fact that, we have some pretty good evidence. And when you get a lot of citizens really sort of engaged on an issue to the point where they are spending lots of scarce resources, contacting their Congress people, talking to others, attending meetings, and so on and so forth, when you have lots of that happening, it really can impact what happens to policy. The existence of policy change or, for example, the absence of unfavorable policy change. A great recent example of this was all of the grassroots lobbying. If any of you happen to follow Washington, D.C. politics, there was potentially going to be this enormous sort of conglomeration of energy companies within the Washington, D.C. area, within the district. And there was a lot of grassroots mobilization around that in response to that, actually in opposition to that. And that grassroots mobilization was largely successful in preventing the purchase of Pepco by some other large company that, I don't know, one large company by another large company. But anyway, so we know that civic engagement can certainly have a role. And we have even more systematic evidence. People have looked at, for example, what happens when you have really powerful citizens groups that go up against, say, really powerful business lobbies. One way of thinking about that, or one way of distinguishing between those two, is to think about the difference between inside lobbying and outside lobbying. And so inside lobbying is when lobbying occurs basically among policymakers within Washington, D.C. Outside lobbying would be when citizens or other individuals outside of the policymaking community are activated by some organization. And so outside lobbying can actually turn out to be really important. And a lot of really what I'm talking about in the book would be examples of outside lobbying. Okay, all right, so as I said, I'm going to be focusing a lot on communication, and I'm going to be focusing a lot on what kinds of thoughts come to mind, what in individuals' heads when they are mobilized around certain kinds of issues, and what impact does that have on the likelihood that they spend scarce resources on politics. And so, what I want to argue, and the key sort of theoretical argument, is that rhetoric, that kind of rhetoric, can introduce previously unrecognized communicative barriers to mobilization and engagement. And the name that I give for that in the book is self-undermining rhetoric. So that would be rhetoric that brings to mind thoughts and considerations that undermine the very purpose that rhetoric is trying to achieve. And what I'm going to do in the talk today is give you a number of examples of what exactly that might look like on the ground. But that's sort of the key sort of organizing principle. Okay? All right. So that's like by way of introduction and overview. And so now what I want to do is sort of transition into some of the more specific content and claims that are in the book. And so the book is about economic insecurity, and in particular sort of heightened economic insecurity that we've experienced in the US over the past generation. And when I say over the past generation, I largely mean from about the time approximately of the early 1970s. And so this comes in a variety of forms. Many of you are probably very familiar with some of these. For instance, the last one. But you know, in general, we have increased threat of job loss, and by that I mean involuntary job loss. Increased cost of health care. And really, you know, it's interesting to sort of say, I mean, yes, on the one hand, we have the Affordable Care Act now. On the other hand, arguably, the Affordable Care Act did not address sort of why the bills are so high in the first place, though they did sort of help to, you know, to address sort of people's ability to pay the bills. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Increased retirement insecurity, and that has to do with sort of not having defined benefit pensions that we once had, or at least were more common, I'd say 30 to 40 years ago, as well as sort of potential threats to Social Security and Medicare. And then, as I said, the increased cost of higher education, which many of you are probably extremely more familiar with than you wish to be. Here are some headlines. Again, I'm sure many of you have seen many, many articles on a lot of those different forms of economic insecurity. Here are a bunch of headlines that just sort of, you know, that you might have seen already. So, health insurance costs rising sharply this year, study shows. 1 in 2 new college graduates is jobless or underemployed. Social Security's financial health worsens. Sorry, this is so depressing. I know I need like a picture of like a puppy or a kitten like after this slide, and I always forget until I'm actually reading these things in front of a crowd. Lost in recession, toll on underemployed and underpaid, so on and so forth. Okay. So the question is, so all of you are probably familiar, broadly speaking, with a lot of these trends, and so the question is what the political consequences of those trends are. And I think one of the political consequences that many people have already remarked about, and I'm by no means the first person to say anything about this, is that we haven't really seen a lot of large-scale political pressure around these kinds of issues. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of this in a second, as well as try to argue against counterexamples that you might be thinking about in your heads right now. And so here's just a couple of quotes that kind of make this point. So this is from Baumgartner et al. In 2009, published this huge volume on lobbying. And they wrote, talked about an almost complete absence of these issues on the policy agenda, writing, there's a relative paucity of issues relating to the economic security of working class Americans right now. Here's another quote. This comes from Jacob Hacker, who arguably sort of wrote, you know, I won't say one of the first, but certainly one of the most recent, most prominent books on economic insecurity called The Great Risk Shift. He wrote, America's leaders could have responded to these forces of economic insecurity by reinforcing the flood walls that protect families from economic risk. Instead, lacking strong political pressure, i.e. civic engagement as one form of, what could be one form of that, to address new and newly intensified risks, or to shore up dwindling protections, for years these leaders have acted in ways that have further eroded the flood walls that protect families. Okay, and there's just a couple of examples of people sort of remarking upon the basic assumption that I take at the starting point of this project. Okay. All right, so at this point I want to give a couple of examples, and I want to give one counterexample. Okay, so the first potential counterexample is many of you might be sitting there thinking, well, okay, but wait a minute, like, don't we have Occupy Wall Street? Like, isn't that like the best counterexample there is to everything that you're talking about? Now, I will say this, you know, the nice thing about Occupy Wall Street is it gave us some really great pictures and signs. And so we have the tax the big dogs on the small dog. And then we have this guy who says, Dear 1%, we fell asleep for a while, just woke up, sincerely the 99%. As a side note, I don't think that admitting that you fell asleep during something important is exactly the most persuasive maneuver. But anyway, he seems self-satisfied. And so, you know, and I think, like, you know, sorry? At least, like, so there's, I think, you know, initially one might think that this is a really good counterexample. And I think, but there's some good evidence to suggest that it actually might not be. And one reason why it might not be is because it turns out that actually a lot of the people who attended the Occupy Wall Street rally, so when surveys were done of people who attended the Occupy Wall Street rally, it turns out that actually people were far less likely to be facing economic insecurity than one might think. And in fact, actually, you know, in these surveys, what you find is that about 1/3 of the people who attended actually reported household incomes of over $100,000. And when people were asked, why is it that you're here? People were, and it was an open-ended question, they could say whatever they want. And so most people would say something along the lines of, I'm concerned about the distribution of economic resources in the country, and/or I'm concerned about corporate influence over government in the country. And which, you know, kind of jives with sort of, you know, we think about Occupy Wall Street, potentially one of the, you know, first things that comes to mind is sort of the 1%, 99% language, and that certainly gets at that. What did not get mentioned nearly as often were any of the economic insecurity issues that I mentioned before. And so the likelihood that people said I'm concerned about unemployment was much, much lower. The likelihood that they said I'm concerned about college costs was much, much lower. And so it's very much sort of focused on the distribution of income and corporate influence over government. So I mention all this just to say that I actually don't think that Occupy Wall Street is necessarily a great counterexample. Here's some other examples, though. So speaking of healthcare, so Healthcare for America Now, HCAN, was arguably the most prominent organization fighting for healthcare reform in 2009, 2010. Maybe it's a household name, maybe it's not, but it was a progressive coalition. They had a lot of labor unions. They had a lot of the progressive organizations that were working with them. Okay? They had 500,000 people on their list by March of 2010. And so, you know, arguably, you know, this was a mostly, though not entirely, organization that was mobilizing over the internet. And so when I say on the list, those are people who sort of, you know, arguably were members. So about 500,000 people. But when I asked them, I interviewed some of the people who were the heads of it. And I should say that HCAN, Healthcare for America Now, was in many ways very, very successful. I mean, you know, in the sense that they sort of very successfully kept healthcare on the agenda even when a variety of roadblocks were put in its way throughout 2009 and the beginning of 2010. I did, though, ask, like, you know, who exactly was the list composed of? And what I found was that the list, the members, were mostly composed of middle-class or upper-middle-class professionals who had health insurance. And so what that means, essentially, is that the people who were sort of most active with Healthcare for America Now were actually people who arguably were sort of not personally, or at least likely, at least, to be personally affected by it. So that's one thing. And I should say that, I mean, again, Healthcare for America Now was extremely successful in a lot of ways. You know, when it was first formed, its main goal was a public insurance option, which, as everybody knows, was not part of the ultimate legislation. Here's a second example. This is from around the same time, MoveOn.org, which, you know, perhaps is more of a household name. MoveOn.org has about 7 million members, many people who are personally touched by student loans. And when I interviewed some of the people who were the head of MoveOn.org, and I asked them about their, in this case, fundraising around this issue, around the time of, say, 2009, 2010, what I found was that their fundraising around this issue was actually, for the most part, not successful. And they actually made a point when I talked to them about this of saying that that was in contrast to other issues. So it wasn't sort of a situation where, you know, it's 2009, 2010, nobody's giving to anything. But actually, you know, the student loans were particularly sort of problematic as a campaign issue. Okay? So that's it for sort of like motivating examples. And the reason why I mention these examples is just to sort of like, you know, suggest that actually like there is sort of something to the idea that we haven't sort of seen the kind of mobilization that we might expect. And to suggest that even to the extent we've seen something that might sound similar, that actually when you dig a little bit deeper, it seems like there's a lot of people who are personally affected who aren't necessarily becoming active in the way that we might expect. Okay. So one thing I'm interested in is just sort of from like a purely sort of public opinion point of view is do Americans actually view these economic insecurity issues as important political problems, right? Because it's entirely possible that they don't. It's entirely possible that they say, well, you know, the household should be dealing with this. You know, household should be saving enough for retirement. Household should be dealing with, you know, health emergencies as they arise and so on and so forth. But there's actually a lot of good evidence to suggest that no, you know, overall, many Americans actually do support political solutions to some of these problems. And so just to give you a sense, this is from a survey that was published in 2009. They found that 80%, this was Page and Jacobs, a book called Class War, ? So 80% of respondents support using tax dollars to help pay for job retraining programs. 64% favor national health insurance. 64% think employers should provide retirement benefits. 66% want adequate Social Security, and 70% support using tax dollars to make college affordable. And so I think this is sort of, you know, gives you this is just a snapshot. It was that was happened to be published in 2009, but it gives you a sense that I think, you know, the idea that there is sort of, you know, political will here is pretty reasonable. Okay. I should also say that actually one of the things that Page and Jacobs also do, this is the entire United States here, they also do just look at Republicans and just high-income individuals, and they find actually majorities or supermajorities on all of these questions as well. Okay, so I think at least like from a broad, like, you know, at a basic sort of public opinion level, it suggests that like in principle, Americans are mobilizable on these issues, or at least many Americans are mobilizable on these issues. And so then I'm going to sort of turn to a question of, okay, well, what happens when they get mobilized, right? And so like, what does this actually look like, and what might the barriers to it be? And so my focus, for the purpose of the talk in the book, though I'll come back to some other stuff at the end, is going to be on donations of time and money to politics. So not necessarily like people paying attention or not, or other sorts of decisions, like, for example, turning out to vote or choosing which candidate to support, although I am working on that with some more recent stuff. And so the answer of like, you know, you want to think about, you know, what kinds of organizations might be engaged in mobilization. The answer to that has kind of changed over time. And this, of course, doesn't go as far back as it could, but I mean, if you want to sort of compare, say, having labor unions and cross-class membership federations like the Elks or the Moose and organizations like that from the middle of the 20th century, then the rise of citizen groups that largely were direct mail focused, and then later on became netroots focused, so internet focused, from the 60s and then to the 2000s. And so MoveOn.org, the example I gave earlier, they would certainly fit into here. Citizen groups, you know, could encompass lots of different organizations, like, for example, the Sierra Club, which actually has been around for much longer than the 60s, but, you know, that would sort of be an example there. Citizen groups is basically a catch-all for, you know, organizations that are essentially for people outside of professional obligations, individuals outside of professional obligations. Okay. And so now we have these kinds of organizations, so citizen groups and especially internet-based citizen groups, they're most likely to be doing the mobilization. And so I want to sort of, the key argument that I make in the book is that, you know, so we have individuals, Americans, who largely would seem to be mobilizable given that they are willing to support political action on these, or political action on these issues. We have organizations that are sort of willing to mobilize them, and of course the MoveOn and the HCAN examples from earlier sort of help to support that point. And so the question, that's really, you know, why it is that I turn to communication, and why it is that I turn to the potential for communicative barriers to mobilization that really haven't been recognized before. And that's what leads me to my key claim in the book, which is that economic insecurity issues might be especially difficult to mobilize people around if you're trying to get them to spend money or time, precisely because they remind them of other things on which they need to spend money. And notice, and like, reflect for a second upon the fact that like that's not true of a lot of other issues. If you're trying to mobilize people around, say, the environment or various forms of certain civil rights issues, lots of foreign policy issues, abortion, issues like that, same-sex marriage. For the most part, those don't really refer people or remind people rather of other things on which they need to spend money. But a lot of the economic insecurity issues, like that's exactly what they do. They're all about the fact that college is so expensive, or healthcare is so expensive, or you might not have enough money for retirement. Like they're all about like personal problems that people are facing. And so the problem is, and that if you remind people about other things on which they need to spend money, it can actually make them less willing to spend money. And it turns out that if they're in the labor force, it can also make them less willing to spend time. And so that's sort of that's at the crux of the communicative barrier that arises during mobilization. And so as I said before, the name I give for that in the book is self-undermining rhetoric, because what's happening essentially is you have this rhetoric that on the one hand is mentioning issues that people find to be really, really important, but on the other hand is bringing to mind considerations, i.e. the other things on which they need to spend money, that actually undermine the very purpose the rhetoric is trying to achieve. And so what that breaks out to, if you think about expectations, is that if people are, regardless of whether they're in the labor force, they're less likely to spend money when you mention these issues, even though they care about them. But yet, their willingness to spend time really depends. And so if they're in the labor force, they're less likely to spend time. If they're not in the labor force, they actually can be mobilized at that point, because the issues are important, they care about them. And it doesn't remind them about, essentially doesn't remind them about a time constraint. There's a little bit more sort of psychology that underlies like where this comes from. I'm going to skip that for right now, but I'm happy to come back to it during Q&A. What I want to do in the few minutes that remain is two things. One is to provide some experimental evidence, just to give you a sense of sort of how it is I even test these claims in the book, and then also sort of talk about some other interesting historical examples. Okay. So first of all, in the experiment. So what I've done is I've partnered with a number of organizations, one of which, some of the people, you might be familiar with the Ithaca Health Alliance, which is downtown, or US PIRG, and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, that's the 501c4, the political arm of the American Cancer Society. And so what I've done is I've done a number of experiments where that basically look like this. And so I have three groups. I have a control group that just gets basic information about the organization, whatever the organization is, and then get asked if they want to donate money. And then I have two treatment groups where they get that same general information, and then they get some issue information. And that issue information either refers to an economic insecurity issue or refers to some other issue that could potentially be on the agenda of that organization, but isn't directly about people's experiences with economic insecurity. So just to give you an idea, in this case, it might be, let's talk about the cost of health care. In this case, it might be something like, we're going to talk about research on improved methods for palliative care, particularly for cancer patients. Okay. And then I can also do this where I keep the information exactly the same, but instead I ask them, would you be willing to volunteer with this organization? So this is like a measure of time. And so just to give you an overview of what I find when I do that, is that I find that between 20 to 50% less money is raised when you mention these economic insecurity issues relative to a control group that doesn't get them. And so here I am giving people extra information about an issue that they find to be important, and they're actually less willing to donate money. And both the amount that they donate as well as actually just the mere act of donating, becoming a donor. And then the same thing with volunteering, but here it really does depend upon whether or not they're in the labor force. And so what we see here, through a variety of different experiments, and again, I won't go through the details of each one, but what we see is like through a variety of different experiments that, over and over again, we have these issues where we have organizations that are mobilizing people. We have people who, and I actually really should sort of stress this. Remember at the beginning I said, that existing explanations for civic engagement tend to focus on attributes of the individual. Well, a lot of the people who are facing economic insecurity aren't necessarily poor. I mean, they're in many cases, they're far from objectively poor. But yet they're still not necessarily willing to donate money to this cause. And another way to sort of support that argument is to say that even if they're 20 to 50% less likely to give money when they receive this economic insecurity information, they potentially are very much more willing to give money, say, to the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network when you give them information about, say, the palliative care. So an issue that doesn't remind them about economic insecurity that they're facing. So you can sort of see a divergence there. Okay. So let me, I'm going to conclude with some general remarks, and then I'm going to sort of, I want to also sort of talk about, how we can sort of think about these communicative barriers affecting other forms of civic engagement. So first of all, so as I said, we've seen this large rise in economic insecurity over the past generation, but arguably observed a very muted political response, even though we have organizations that are trying to mobilize people in a lot of cases, and even though many of the people who are facing economic insecurity are not objectively poor. That's not per se the reason why they might not get involved in these ways. Okay. And so what are the implications for civic engagement on these issues? And so first of all, I think it's interesting to think about, when people who study American political behavior like to sort of remark a lot about how self-interest often doesn't seem to motivate behavior as much as we might expect. And if you're familiar with, say, Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, there's a lot of problems with that book, but sort of the core part of it, which is this idea that essentially why aren't people engaging in more self-interested behavior? The findings I have here sort of speak to that in a different way and provide some evidence for sort of why it is that they might not be, precisely because you're talking about their self-interest when you're asking them to spend scarce resources. Here's some other examples. So chapter 7 in the book, which is the conclusion, after I've sort of, talked about move on, I've talked about, gone through all the experimental evidence and some survey evidence and like some other, historical patterns and some public opinion evidence and all that kind of stuff. What I try to do in the final chapter is to sort of say, look, we've seen movements related to economic insecurity issues in the past. And so how can we sort of start to understand that? How can we start to understand some of the organizations and the strategies that they use that arguably were actually quite successful? So ACORN is one of them, and the National Welfare Rights Organization would be another. And a fuller description is in the book, but one of the things that I find is that, for the most part, these organizations actually weren't that successful at getting people to engage in politics. They were very successful when the focus was on particular kinds of problems, solving particular kinds of problems that people had. And whether it had to do with specific problems with welfare agencies, whether it had to do with specific neighborhood problems, like, for example, a problem like right outside their door on their street or something like that. But when things turn to matters of politics, that's often when membership dropped off. And as a slight anecdote to that, so after the book came out earlier this year, one day in March, I got a random email from Wade Rathke. I don't know if any of you are familiar with who that is, but he was the founder of Acorn. And I saw his name, I knew who he was, and I saw his name in my inbox, and I was like, oh my God. And, the subject line of the email was, your book. And I was like, that sounds ominous. And it turns out, and he emailed, and he was really, really nice. And he said, I read your book online. So that was the first time actually somebody actually told me they read the book. Like, I know the book exists, but I don't know if anybody reads it. And it had just come out, too. It had only been out for about a month at that point. And he said, what you have found, exactly is consistent with the challenges that we faced at Acorn. It's exactly consistent. And in fact, if any of you subscribe to his magazine, Social Policy, he is, actually, he put a review on Amazon in the book, and then also actually wrote a fuller review for the magazine that he publishes, Social Policy. And so it was gratifying to sort of see somebody who founded the organization. I talk about Acorn a little bit at the end of the book. Actually founded the organization, sort of out of the blue, coming to me and saying, yes, the kinds of challenges that you're talking about with getting people who are facing economic insecurity engaged, that's exactly what happened. All right. The other thing I should say, and to really be depressing, is everything, the psychology that I'm talking about here, so that you're being reminded of these economic insecurity, these forms of economic insecurity that you're facing, what that sort of, to the extent that that is demobilizing, it's because of essentially you're being reminded about these other things. I need to spend money on these other things. So there's sort of opportunity costs there. We have moments in our history, Great Depression being the best example of this, where arguably those opportunity costs weren't really present. And so the idea of sort of spending time on marching, either marches or political meetings or things like that, versus, say, trying to do something about your unemployment, there wasn't necessarily a trade-off. And that's actually, the accounts I've read of sort of the unemployment movement in the 1930s are basically consistent with that story. Basically, things were just that bad. There weren't opportunity costs. On the other hand, there was a study published. The data for this are absolutely incredible. They had a random sample of unemployed people in the early 1970s. So not even all Americans, specifically unemployed Americans. And what they found is that the kinds of trade-offs that I'm talking about here were exactly the kinds of trade-offs that those people identified when asked, why is it that you don't sort of, quote unquote, take to the streets? That wasn't the language they used, but sort of, why is it that you aren't sort of more politically involved with other kinds of organizations? And what you saw a lot of the times was basically, look, I can't do this if it really means, if the choice is either doing that or, say, waiting to hear back on a resume or sending my resume out, going on a job interview, and so on and so forth. Those kinds of trade-offs were very salient to the people who answered that survey. Okay. All right. This is the final slide. Self-undermining rhetoric, I would argue, can help explain why it is that we haven't seen the kind of large-scale political pressure that we might expect to see on economic insecurity issues that are so directly facing people's lives and increasingly over the past 30 to 40 years. And so what I'm doing now in a variety of different research programs is looking at how it actually might apply in other contexts. And so basically sort of taking this new way of thinking about civic engagement and the barriers to civic engagement and thinking about why it is that we don't see more action on climate change, why we don't see more, why it is that, or how it is that the evidence that gets provided for social ills. So what I mean by that is sort of, there are people out there who don't have health insurance. We can describe that in a lot of different ways in terms of individuals who don't have health insurance or large groups who don't have health insurance. And so on and so forth. How does that evidence affect whether or not people become more engaged on that issue? Money in politics as well. Economic voting. The economic voting thing is interesting because now here what I'm doing is looking at essentially the Thomas Frank argument. Not just the fact that people might not be using, or the fact that people's economic self-interest might not be motivating their vote choice, and but rather why? What are the barriers to that? Especially when in campaign after campaign, I mean, heck, look at all the announcement speeches we saw over the summer. Like, these standard of living issues are constantly being mentioned. I mean, every single candidate, almost every single candidate, is mentioning these kinds of standard of living issues. And so, like, why don't we see more sort of self-interest when it comes to voting, economic self-interest when it comes to voting? Okay, and same-sex marriage as well. So anyway, I will stop there. I think that should be about 30 minutes. And in case you forgot who I am, that would be terrible, or why it is that you're here, or what university we're at, well, here it is. So thank you very much.